Over the past 100 years, Titanic, for better or worse, has transcended from just a lucrative concept for a company to a physical ship, to a horrific disaster, to a romantic lost treasure, and finally to where I think she rests now, a worldwide phenomenon. Titanic herself is known throughout the globe for reasons one might consider good or bad, but she has reached a point of fame that will continue her story and legacy for generations. It might come as a surprise that I also believe that the general populace would be unable to identify the Titanic if asked to do so. Indeed, if given a police lineup of Titanic with other ocean liners, most non-Titanic people would need help to spot the world's most famous ship correctly. See a boat with smokestacks? It must be the Titanic. This lack of knowledge might anger many in the Titanic community, but not me. While getting the facts correct is essential, the idea and appeal of Titanic are also quite valuable. But my point about the public's inability to recognize Titanic isn't meant to criticize. It illustrates that I don't believe the ship itself is what makes her physically famous. The allure of Titanic, besides perhaps the disaster and the death, had been the luxury and opulence surrounding the Gilded Age from long ago. And the epitome of that luxury had always seemed to be the ship's magnificent first-class rooms, and one in particular has always and will forever top them all, the Grand Staircase. Perhaps this superb interior structure would now be identified more as Titanic than the actual Titanic. Ironic, of course, since there are no known photographs of the actual Titanic Grand Staircase, just her sisters, Olympic. Long before it was made famous in the most famous of all Titanic movies, it was already idolized in other Titanic media. All Titanic movies have some form of grand staircase, as the film and TV producers and set designers understood the importance of including a great... Oh, how embarrassing. Well, I should say then most entertainment producers had some form of grand staircase in their Titanic movie, even the Nazis. However, the grand staircase almost always receives proper attention as the crowning achievement of the twin sister ships Olympic and Titanic. And it did so before Titanic was synonymous with the lost Gilded Age. But form follows function, so before we deep dive into everything that one ever needed to know about the grand staircase aboard Titanic, let's look at how it was designed and built. While designing Titanic and Olympic, the passengers' comfort regarding their movement aboard must be paramount. That is something shipbuilders and architects need to focus on even today. A ship is very similar to a lengthy skyscraper. Decks are rather long floors, and to traverse them, stairs and eventually elevators were added to make going up and down more accessible. In the beginning of a ship's life, stairs or ladders were in place for convenience, but as comfort increased and the ticket costs went up, the design could also. Eventually, space could be allocated for lofty and open staircases and entrances, as cabins and staterooms wouldn't have to take up every square foot to turn a profit anymore. If we jump ahead to today, you even have massive staircases in the form of atriums aboard cruise ships. So Titanic's grand staircases, remember she had two of them, but for the purpose of this video we'll be focusing on the main one, the forward one. Her grand staircases were perhaps the grandfather of the modern day cruise ship atrium. That doesn't mean the design was perfect, and we'll discuss that later. Of course, the grand staircase on Titanic and the aft grand staircase were in first class. The main forward staircase connected all of first class decks with cabins, boat deck at the top and E deck at the bottom. F deck and below had no cabins for first class, and the stairs on that level weren't so grand, so we won't be talking about that level. The aft grand staircase only connected A deck to C deck because underneath on D deck were the first class and second class kitchens, so it could go no further. That was one of the minor flaws, the location of the staircases. 3 elevators were included with the forward staircase. These were becoming increasingly necessary on ocean liners, and within the future, just a few years, on larger boats, one would find upwards of 10 elevators spread around the ship. Titanic's 2 staircases, while seemingly placed in suitable locations to share the passenger flow around the decks, had the elevators forward, somewhat hidden, attached to the main staircase. There was something to help call out the location of the elevators, and possibly each deck level in front of the staircase. Lighted sign boxes, attached to the ceiling beams in proper locations. It was reported on Olympic's first voyages that the elevators were seldom used in first class, possibly not even noticed by passengers besides those in the forward cabins. To amend this forward on Britannic, the third and final sister ship to be built, where all notes from Olympic and Titanic were going to be implemented as corrections, a fourth elevator was going to be added right in the middle of her first-class accommodation. Not next to her aft staircase, not forward, but smack in the middle, running from A deck down to E deck, skipping the D deck galleys, of course. Would a single small elevator here have helped passengers get around the ship? Unfortunately, that wouldn't have helped one other critique of the staircase's locations. If you were berthed in one of the suites on C deck or B deck aft, you were quite far from the D deck reception and dining rooms below. Other ocean liners had multiple ways to get to these vital spaces. Regardless, the marvel of the Grand Staircase, which is what it was called back in 1911 and 1912, was not to be ignored. The staircase was built in rooms known as the first class entrance or reception room. Before the lovely wood was installed, the ship's steelwork made the foundation of the stairs. The columns and steps that we see, the walls that would soon have clocks and ornate carvings, all hid the steel designed to strengthen the ship, not only to allow passengers to transverse up and down Titanic. When framing and laying the steel was completed, the next set of craftsmen came in and began the installation of light English oak wall panels around the sides of the entrances. This English oak was designed to follow the paneling, friezes, and architraves, moldings, and other elements found at Hampton Court Palace in England. Designed by the famous architect Sir Christopher Wren, one will discover elements that match William and Mary's style in the Titanic and that palace. The team behind the majority of Titanic's luxurious first-class spaces was Aldham Heaton & Company, with the primary designer Mr. Arthur H. Durand. Mr. Durand and Heaton went with something different from previous White Star Line ships for the staircase itself. Inspired by French and English works with a modern flair, Heaton came up with a masterpiece. We can see the inspiration was perhaps from Dunster Castle in Somerset, England. The redesign at Dunster was done by architect Anthony Salvin in the 1870s, who most famously redesigned Alnwick Castle, the city of which has connections to the Olympic class later in life. The staircase at Dunster and Titanic staircase share striking similarities between the banister and newel post designs. But Heaton added French flares instead of the heavy, thick rails, Louis XIV wrought iron scrollwork with occasional touches of bronze in the form of flowers and foliage. The sides of the staircase fanned out as one descended, and contrary to popular belief, there was enough room for two between the center and side rails. The grand staircase sat securely between the ship's center ironwork that made up the casings, 20 feet in width from column to column, making the stairs about 16 feet wide with the wood installed, and the whole monster of a staircase was 60 feet tall. Of course, at the apex, it felt as if it went all the way to heaven, compliments of the magnificent dome. Oval in shape at 26 feet by 19 feet and about 4.5 feet high, the dome allowed in natural light during the daytime that descended down the wells of the staircase to lower levels. The wrought iron frame of the dome was secured to the outer structure, the weather casing, which protected it from the harsh elements of the North Atlantic. On top of this, 45 skylights allowed in sunlight. The dome's glass was frosted, and it wasn't broken up into smaller pieces to fit in between each decorative element. These more decorative components were bolted and attached to the larger framework, so the glass was larger, albeit curved, pieces. In the center of the dome was a massive 50-light electrolier, not a chandelier because a chandelier has candles, and Titanic's lights were electrified. Surrounding this large electrolier with many cut crystal beads and large glass bowl were more wrought iron decorative elements, which were perhaps open with no glass to allow for ventilation. The dome was not illuminated, except for natural sunlight and the central electrolier, so it was not illuminated at nighttime. It was thought at a time that it was illuminated, but there has been no real evidence to prove this for Olympic or Titanic. This giant staircase was securely built into the ship's steelwork and frame. Contrary to popular theories, this means it could not float out of the ship during the sinking. It was part of Titanic as much as the engine room was part of Titanic. Certainly wood, carvings, and other moldings broke off during the destruction of the sinking, but there is no way a large piece of the staircase came loose and floated up and out. This beauty was built differently than a movie set. Let us descend down the decks now and talk about each element as we encounter them, and what we can find on the grand staircase levels that makes each of them unique. From the boat deck, we enter one of two vestibules on either side. The doors here lead to the boat deck proper, with one door heading into the gymnasium. These vestibules help to keep the elements of the ocean out, especially the draft and the wind, from entering the ship while it is sailing west or east. There are many large windows with rounded tops throughout the levels of boat deck down to B deck. Harlan and Wolff distinguish them as pattern E windows. With 13 panes of thick glass between the mullions, these two let in natural light to illuminate the excellent space. Some of these windows on boat and A deck would open, allowing the air in when the weather was appropriate. But when temperatures were cold, there was luckily a series of electric heaters spread throughout Titanic's entrances. 32 bastion heaters, small and large, 3,500 or 6,000 watts, warmed the entrance halls. Before noting any more of the unique features of the boat deck level, attention must be paid to the woodwork. We mentioned that it hides the steel, and that it is English oak. Famously, the cut of the oak, known as quarter-sawn, along with its French polish and waxing, gave a beautiful and dignified finish. The newel posts, the lower rectangular posts, which are all over the staircase, hold individually hand-carved panels that are made up of fruits, nuts, berries, and flowers. The upper round parts of columns were made up of composite materials, more or less wood parts colored to match the surrounding oak. Above, at the top of the columns, here on boat deck is a Corinthian capital connecting the wooden beam, which of course hides a steel beam underneath. Each deck has columns, but interestingly, each deck has a different capital design, with the boat deck being the most ornate. You'll notice some fancy moldings around the windows, doors, on the ceilings, the railings, and elsewhere. These are all pretty common, standard carvings. Some of them are so standard they are used throughout Titanic. Others, however, rivet counters have lovingly given nicknames to. What makes a lot of them amazing is the fact that most were hand-carved. This one is known as bead and barrel. This other one is called bellflower and bead. This is called egg and dart, and found throughout the ship. The carving running along the banisters, just below the railing, has laurel leaves and ribbon. The carving around the ceiling beams, the architrave carving, doesn't exactly have a name, but pieces of it from Olympic and Britannic are greatly sought after by collectors. There are many other ornate moldings, an endless parade of beading and brackets, laurel leaves and acanthus cornices. It just illustrates the attention to detail in this magnificent space. Even more incredible when you consider that craftsmen had to create everything 3 times for the 3 sisters. We have to also note the electroliers quickly. These 12-inch diameter 3 light bulb brass gilt beaded electroliers are attached to the ceiling coffers throughout the levels of the entrance halls. On boat and A deck levels, these light fixtures have bowls made up of strands of beaded glass. They have 546 glass beads for each light, and 1 more for the finial. On the lower decks, the bowls became solid cut glass, which were no less impressive. Sadly, the solid glass cut bowls did not survive the sinking, unlike the beaded bowls, which are still attached to this day. The cut glass bowls were heated from the bulbs when they were on. Contact with the freezing water or swirling debris caused them to shatter, pop, and break. Continuing the tour on the boat deck, we come to the upright Steinway piano in the forward port corner. Here, the ship's quartet would play regularly during the day. The music would flow as the light did from above throughout the staircase levels. At this location, the band played for most of the night as the ship was sinking. A series of plush armchairs and settees and blue fabric around the entrance allowed one to sit and listen to this band, rest, relax, or also just wait for a friend. These heavy pieces of furniture, like the piano, were hooked and attached to the walls to prevent them from moving during heavy seas. Other pieces of furniture in the entrances, which included French walnut chairs and settees, were allowed to be loose, at least the chairs, perhaps not the settees. We are now about to head down to A deck, passing one of the doorways to the forward cabins on boat deck. A sign above the door would tell us what cabin would be where, and similar signs would be found around the entrances. But we must first talk about perhaps the most famous element of the most famous staircase of the most famous ship in history, the clock and surround, which are known as Honor and Glory Crowning Time. This timepiece itself could have its own video, so we'll give a brief rundown to save on time. Forgive the pun.
What pun?
Shut up, he thinks he's witty.
This panel was designed and carved by master carver Charles Wilson. The clock allegory was inspired by sculptor Auguste Marie Tunet's work in the Palace of Tuileries, which was sadly destroyed during a government revolution in 1871. Many elements of the clock panel can symbolize so much of the Edwardian and Gilded Ages, and the fate of Titanic. I suggest visiting Alan St. George's website, titanicClock.com. Alan is the master sculptor who recreated Titanic's clock panel and other elements from Titanic in near perfection, so visit his website to understand better. However, there's a story that goes that Titanic left Belfast on April 2nd without the clock installed, and a mirror was put into its place. So, to many, Titanic sank without the clock ever installed. However, this seems very unlikely. Titanic sat at Southampton for a week, where Harland and Wolff had a warehouse and men employed. Titanic had many fittings and furniture still to be installed and finished, so during this week, there was more than enough time, forgive the pun,
Shut up, he thinks he's witty.
to install the clock, especially seeing how this was considered to be the centerpiece of Titanic. Down onto A deck now, we can't help but ignore the third major element of the staircase besides the dome and clock, the cherub. Continuing the theme of being inspired by palaces, especially French palaces, Titanic's cherubs are near replicas of those seen in the gardens of Versailles. In contrast, stone in France, Titanic's cherubs were cast in bronze. According to our knowledge, they were made by Perry & Company, which supplied Titanic with many light fixtures, including many of the ornate first-class fixtures from cabins and public rooms. Titanic had two large cherubs, one forward and a mirrored, nearly identical version aft. They might have been only polished bronze, but some elements of gilt with the torch or the fabric coverings, we can't be sure. We sure wish we could find them now. A deck was an important one for passengers because it led to many public rooms, and was the uppermost level to access the elevators. They did not run up to boat deck. This level also had access to the promenade deck, which was partially covered, and passengers could walk around at its total length. A deck also had a notice board where the ship's daily run was posted and any other important messages for the entire passenger populace. Similar vestibules from boat deck were here too, with those being the only ways to access the promenade while at sea, as the other two doors were locked shut. The doors to the exterior decks had deadlights, round windows akin to portholes, but they didn't open. These doors were on boat deck, A deck, and B deck. When needed, the doors could be kept open and ensured they closed with a closing device known as a door check that was mounted at the top. Large rugs were laid on the decks to protect the floors, which were made out of linoleum. Linoleum was a robust and efficient material at the time. It wasn't chosen because it was new and luxurious, it was just chosen as an excellent alternative to the usual ship flooring materials that had been in service for decades, such as wood or ceramic tiles. The steps of the staircase too were covered in linoleum. The lino-covered treads, with a rise of 6 inches, initially had brass nosings, the edge of the steps. By April 1912, Olympic had this replaced with rubber. Perhaps it was due to the brass being a safety issue, a trip hazard. Olympic staircase received numerous upgrades for safety, including grab rails, added on top of the railings over the years. We believe Titanic steps had the rubber nosings and not the brass edging since Olympic did in April 1912. To properly announce the deck, brass letters gilded with gold were attached to the walls at appropriate locations. Call buzzers were also spread around the entrances at appropriate locations. This was the age when a lord or lady or just a rich American would expect to sit in the hall and summon a steward for any need, and they would do so by pressing a button. Before heading down to B deck, we must mention the paneling on the half landings. Surrounded by fluted pilasters, or wall columns, magnificent carvings framed the paneling here in the center to replicate the works by Grinling Gibbons. Many of his works can be found inside the Marvels of Wren, so it is fitting that they were present on some of the paneling aboard Titanic. On early Olympic, the panels, which were framed by the Gibbons carvings, were left blank, but paintings were added much later in her career. Second-class Titanic passenger Edith Brown Haseman, while touring Titanic's first-class spaces with her parents before sailing, recalled seeing big, beautiful oil paintings somewhere aboard the ship. So possibly, there was a chance Titanic had these paintings, before Olympic ever did. Down we are on B deck, and another thing to note is the lack of cherub on the center newel like on A deck above. Instead, here we have a pineapple. Pineapples are a classical English design element and used to symbolize hospitality. Unfortunately, this is where we have a Titanic mystery that is yet to be solved. We don't have photos showing us, or enough evidence to know what the B-deck landing exactly looked like. Currently, we assume it looked much like the C-deck level, which we have seen and we will talk about soon, or Britannic's cutaway drawing, but we never can be certain nor have we seen enough detail regarding the cherubs. How many, the size, and even if they are on the side flanking the staircase. We only know that there was none in the center. But B deck would have been quite a hub on sailing and departure days. Here passengers would find the boarding entrances, port and starboard. Otherwise, this is a relatively simple staircase landing, mainly for connecting staterooms and leading to corridors. Dividing the passenger accommodation from the entrances were double doors, covered in red baize to help with the sound deadening, and also to prevent the draft from rushing down the corridor. The doors might have had brass studs, but they certainly had oval windows with heavy brass hardware, and were double acting, so no matter which way you pushed and pulled, they opened. The side corridors to cabins could be sealed off with heavy curtains, known as portiere curtains. However, most of these corridors were prepared for doors to be installed if it was found necessary. Once more, we descend towards C deck now. We find yet again a difference in the center newel post, but this may have helped passengers differentiate the decks as they descended. But what we can see again, for sure this time, are tiny cherubs or putti, flanking the staircase on newel posts. RMS Titanic Inc. famously found and recovered one of these small putti, probably from the C deck aft level of the grand staircase. These are drastically smaller than the large cherub on A deck, and there is a possibility that it had a twin brother alongside it on the newel post due to its size. We have even seen very similar examples of this puto, with a brother, as fixtures, and in a Britannic cutaway there are indeed two on either side on C deck. It's just unfortunately too difficult to make out on the Olympic photograph due to the lack of quality. Each staircase deck served a function besides connecting passengers to cabins and public spaces. Here on C deck was the inquiry and purser's office. Properly discussing how this space functions would fill up another video, so we don't have time for that.
Shut up, he thinks he's witty.
However, passengers would queue here by these dividers for most of their questions and enter the purser's office via the door just forward. One interesting element to note is the wall directly facing passengers as they descended the staircase. Each deck has its designation called out on the wall with the brass letters we mentioned, with another clock in Gibbons surround to emphasize the entire element. Below the clock was a sign to inform passengers that every night, depending on whether they were heading west or east, the clock would be adjusted accordingly, so please fix your timepieces. There was also a slightly hidden fuse panel in the entrance halls, which, when opened, would allow one to control the lights for that level of the staircase. Now, D deck is an entirely different story that would need its own video too. It is no longer an entrance hall here alone. It is a reception room or lounge for the dining room, and it was, without a doubt, the most popular room aboard Titanic. So crowded was the reception room that stewards had to find chairs elsewhere on the ship for seating. Thanks to the band, the white-painted Jacobean space with lush Axminster carpet was the place to be every night of the voyage. The room was large, not just taking up the entire width of the ship, but D deck was taller, so there were additional steps on the staircase, and the railings were extended on the side. The columns were changed to follow the Jacobean feel of the room, but the most remarkable change to the staircase was the addition of the 21-light magnificent candelabrum on the center newel. The handsome base, urn, and elements of fruit and flowers, all made in bronze, helped to create a palatial effect. The final level of the grand staircase takes us to E deck. Here it terminates in a simple lobby. We believe the stairs might have had the same elements from above, continuing with the wrought iron newel post and pineapples. The entrance hall itself was made up of the same handsome English oak paneling, except there was no clock this time, nor decorative carvings. At this landing were a few hidden secrets: lockers utilizing every bit of space above the fan trunk, a secure room for the ship's keys, and some hidden infamous Bostwick gates. But their use will need to be talked about another time. Nothing says Titanic more than stepping in front of or onto the grand staircase, either in person at a physical recreation where you can get your photo taken, or even in a digital world like our Titanic model. I've even seen people get their photos taken in front of a grand staircase backdrop on cruise ship, so that's something. But I will keep arguing that this staircase, the dome, the cherub, the clock, the sweeping fan steps of the railing, it's what personifies the beauty and even the mystery of Titanic. This is something that we don't see anymore in today's world ever being built. We have to go for the simple, cost-effective, and the clean modern lines. For one reason or another, we've abandoned the grand staircases altogether, and one could even argue that it is because Titanic sank that the age of anything grand was now at an end. Sorry, Normandy. If you really wish to truly experience Titanic's staircase, then you must travel to Alnwick, England to the White Swan Hotel, where you will not only find famously most of Olympic's first-class lounge intact, but segments of her grand staircase. You can understand what it was like to walk down the stairs and touch the railings and the carvings, getting as close to being on Titanic as possible. Ironically, the iconic Titanic Grand Staircase, of which there are no photographs of, is more famous than all the photographs of Titanic herself. The staircase is long gone, lost to the destruction wrought by nature and time, but the memory of the staircase, its construction, the craftsmanship, and those who walked up and down the steps will never fade. The team at THG would like to thank all of our supporters on Patreon, especially the officers, for keeping us afloat and allowing us to continue working on all of our projects. You guys truly are letting us research, create, and rebuild Titanic bit by bit. You share the love we have for this great ship and all those who sailed aboard her. If you want to check out more, and perhaps consider joining the project or just supporting, you can click any of the links below. It's on our Patreon where you'll find a lot of information and everything else related to Titanic honor and glory.